In the 1930s, America was experiencing the worst economic crisis our country had ever faced. People lost their jobs, their savings, and all too often, their hope. It was called the Great Depression, and it hit Georgia doubly hard. Farmers here had already been devastated by the boll weevil and low cotton prices. So come with us to the Washington Wilkes area in the old Cotton Belt to find out what it was like growing up in hard times.
Good morning, boys and girls. Good morning. Nice to. Now, I want to ask you all something. You all have shoes. You don't come to school barefooted? No. When I started...
Russell Slayton likes to show off his old lunchbox and explain to school kids how different life was when he was their age. You see, he grew up during the Great Depression, one of the most difficult times in the history of our nation.
What triggered the Great Depression was the stock market crash, in which people began to invest in stocks as though they were gambling.
The stock market crashed in October 1929, causing factories to cut back and people to lose their jobs. Soon the economy began a horrible downhill slide.
The more people that were laid off couldn't get work, then the less they could purchase washing machines or automobiles or what we call consumer goods. And then the companies cut back and more people were laid off work until finally we had a situation in which 1 out of every 4 Americans was not working.
No jobs meant no money to buy food. Hungry people in Atlanta and other cities lined up for a crust of bread or a bowl of watery soup. Banks closed their doors overnight. For much of the South, the Depression was round 2 of a devastating 1-2 punch. The boll weevil and low cotton prices had already wiped out many a farmer. For rural Georgia, the Depression had started a decade earlier than the rest of the country.
When you get home from school, what do you do every afternoon? No, you play, but I had to get in kindling to start a fire with and help feed the cows and the hogs and so forth.
And of course the farmer always in this area worked from can to can't. You understand that expression? He starts to work as early as he can see in the morning and works until he can't see at night. Particularly during harvest time, you work from can to can't.
Russell Slayton grew up on a working farm, the youngest of 6 children. Luckily, they didn't go hungry. They grew what they needed. For milk, they had cows. For eggs, they had chickens. His family had lived in the Washington Wilkes area for 10 generations. Beautiful homes remind us that this was once one of the richest counties in the state. But people here suffered during the Great Depression, people like Mabel Johnson and her family.
A lot of times, my mother couldn't pay the rent, and she had to find another place to live because we would have to move. And we did move all around about town. I lived on every street in Washington but this way, I think, when I was growing up. And she had lots of pride, and I'm sure it hurt her to have to, do those kind of things, but that's the way it was.
Her father was a traveling salesman, so her mother raised 6 children alone. She would make homemade candies that sold for a nickel a bag just to have grocery money. Through hard times, she remained strong.
Well, my mother had such faith. I've never seen such faith. We never saw her get upset or be frustrated, and we knew she was hurting. She would go to the piano and play when she was blue and Dad wasn't there, and we knew she was blue and missing him. And we cried. She had such a sensitive touch, and we realized that she was hurting, and we all cried when she played.
How many eats a baked sweet potato? You would always have your baked sweet potato.
Most people managed to keep from going hungry, but not everyone. Russell Slayton remembers one boy who came to school without breakfast because his family had run out of food.
His dad had a nickel to give him, and I remember he paid a nickel for an apple, which was a huge apple, and that was his lunch.
Prices were dirt cheap, but no one had any money, so folks became clever about trading what they had for what they needed. For example, Betty Slayton's mother needed jars for canning beans.
And there was a man in the community who drank a lot, and he bought moonshine in half-gallon glass jars. So Mother swapped his wife a bushel of beans, I think, and got 2 dozen jars to can beans in. So they both got what they wanted.
And I made that dress in home economics that I have on there.
When the Great Depression hit, Mabel Johnson was only 14 years old. Those should have been carefree years, spent playing with friends.
I was really the only one in my crowd who things were that bad for. And I remember on Saturdays, they would go on picnics. Well, I would help my grandmother wash the clothes.
If I didn't care more than words can say.
Still, they enjoyed simple pleasures. 1 in 5 families had radios. And on Saturday afternoons, cowboy movies at the picture show cost a dime. But even at that price, going to one was a real luxury, a treat. The Depression also brought out the best in people.
God was good to us. We had good friends, a lot of neighbors, and people who maybe were a little better off than we were. And they would share. Back then, neighbors looked after neighbors. And everybody was concerned about everybody else. And if the word got out, you know, that we needed things, it always came from somewhere.
In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for president, promising voters a New Deal in which Washington would help put people back to work. He won by a landslide, and soon many programs were in place around the state.
So that Georgia, a very poor state, ended up getting a lot of federal programs that helped. Not just welfare, but programs for young people that were funded by the federal government. And since Georgia was a very poor state, didn't pay as many taxes, they really benefited a lot from the federal government. That's why Franklin Roosevelt was a hero to most Georgians.
When World War II began in 1941, the military's need for war materiel would fuel the economy, rebuild the economy. Only then would the worst economic years in the nation's history be over.